Yes, so I'll be sharing with you the national framework which is governing the ethical aspects of biomedical and health research in India. And as many of you would be aware, ICMR is the apex organization in India for biomedical health research. And it is working towards formulation, promotion, and coordination of health research. But I would also like to point you that we are not regulators, so we are not regulating biomedical health research, but we are in the process of promoting the same under the Department of Health Research in the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare. Now, ICMR operates through various mechanisms. So one is it has a network of 27 institutions across the country, the clinical trial registry, a national cancer registry, and it's involved in development of various guideline documents, such as one on good clinical laboratory practices, assisted reproductive technology, stem cell, and the national ethical guidelines. We work in the area of nutrition, we work in the area of outbreaks and emergency, as we are involved right now with COVID-19. And ICMR is therefore involved in both basic clinical, operational, epidemiological, socio-behavioral, all kind of research that concerns human beings. So in fact, anthropology is also part of our research work. And we have a special advisory expert group in ICMR, which promotes research in the area of anthropology. ICMR is also involved in building capacity across the country, and through its various grants program, task forces, fellowships, various types of schemes are there, which you could see from our ICMR website. And ICMR has had a long history of being, developing ethical guidelines for the country. Right from 1980 onwards, the pink book that you see on the left-hand side corner was the first document, followed by another one in 2000, 2006, and guidelines on children. Then this is end of life care. It's a handbook. This handbook is very useful for students because the main ethical guideline, the purple book, is a thick book. And often, as students, you would find the handbook, which is a summary of this, may be very useful for you to refer to. And ICMR has also developed some common forms, guidelines on publication ethics, and some other documents. So what I'll urge you is to also visit our website to download the copies of these documents. They are all available freely. And if you would like to get a hard copy, you can write to me about them. So this page of ICMR, you can just put on Google, ICMR Bioethics Unit, and you can reach us. Now, the ICMR main guidelines of 2017 were released in 2017, about 3 years ago. And the guidelines were developed with the extensive consultative process. So it's not that we just sit in a room with experts and develop, but it's a process of ongoing consultation which went on over 2 years of time, in which this guideline document was received with inputs for a large number of people. And thereafter, we are involved in a number of dissemination and training programs across the country. Right now, because of the pandemic, we are not holding such programs. We are on a hold. But that's why we are happy to participate in webinars and other training courses, which are online. Now, the guidelines have discussed mainly about the basic principles. They start with the principles. The first one being autonomy, or the respect for persons. You all understand that. And the principle of beneficence, where you would like to do as much benefit that you could to the participants without causing them harm. And the principle of justice, where you need to be aware that there is no exploitation, discrimination of any particular individual or group of individuals or communities. And the scope of the guideline is very, very, very broad, because we are covering biomedical research as well as socio-behavioral research, and not only involved with human participants, but also if you're dealing with samples, biological material, or you're talking about their data, even then the guidelines apply for that. So the guidelines has 12 sections. The first 6 are more generic sections, which is general principles, general ethics issues, response. The ones that you see in red are the new sections that have been added. The responsible conduct of research is an important section for each one of us to go through. It talks about how a researcher has to conduct the research properly and ethically, and what are the ethical requirements revolving around publication. As Dr. Rao was just discussing, that it is a responsibility, it's an ethical responsibility to bring the data in public domain, to publish it. whether it is positive or negative results. And then there is a section on ethics committees, informed consent, vulnerability. The one in brown are the sections which were earlier small sections. Now they are into full sections. And then there are specific sections. And then depending on the type of research you're involved in, you could go to that. So for example, there's a section on clinical trials. There's one on public health research, which may be useful to you all working in the area of anthropology. Also socio-behavioral sciences, there is a section. Then there is one on human genetic testing and research, then dealing with biological material, biobanking, and research during humanitarian emergencies such as now. So this is just a summary, and I would like to just briefly address each of these sections. And then the ICMR guideline has given out these 12 sections, which talks about the need for research. Research should not be just done just for the sake of doing it, but there has to be a need, an essentiality for doing research, involving the principle of voluntariness, which means that people who are involved should voluntarily agree. They should not be forced, coerced, or influenced to participate. The principle of non-exploitation, we understand that they should not lead to any racial or any kind of religious, cultural, language-related exploitation or stigmatization of any kind. And we have a social responsibility as a researcher to maintain the fabric of the society. You know, we have, as anthropologists, I think you all understand it very well, how important is our social responsibility in the way we conduct research, ensuring privacy, confidentiality, minimizing risk, to be done by people who are professionally competent by qualification as well as experience, maximizing benefits, being responsible for our actions, to have institutional arrangements or systems in place for adequate monitoring and conduct of the research. And transparency and accountability again boils down to publication or bringing out, doing exactly what is there in the protocol, and you know, making sure that we are accountable for our actions, and also to take care of our environment. We are living in a world right now that we need to protect our environment and our resources. So the general ethical issues, this is the next section in the guideline, which tells about how to do a benefit risk assessment, how to take care of privacy, confidentiality, payments, compensation, ancillary care, conflict of interest. So all of these, I'll just briefly touch upon each of this. So what one has to do when one plans any research is to do a benefit risk assessment, to see, identify what are the kind of benefits. It may be individual, it may be societal, it may be community, which is fine. And then look at the risk. Again, they can be personal risk to an individual, it could be to a group of people, or it could be social risk, it could be physical risk. Sometimes people say, I'm just doing a survey. So there is no risk because I don't do any intervention, I am not giving any drug, I don't have a blood draw, but I'm asking certain questions. Now, this kind of research may also have certain kind of risk because there may be a psychological risk or a social risk. The risk could be due to breach of confidentiality. So it could be, so that's what one has to see, that what kind of discomforts or risk could be there. And then do an assessment to see that whether it is favorable or not favorable, and try to categorize the type of risk. So it could be less than minimal, very low risk, or it could be higher risk where interventions are involved, and accordingly safeguards have to be built into place. Now, sometimes research involves various kind of payment for participation, and these have to be declared to the ethics committee, whether it is a payment in kind or in cash, or there is no payment also, then it has to be declared to the ethics committee, who would like to see whether this is appropriate. So on one hand, you would like to reimburse people for the costs if they have incurred additional costs due to their participation in your research, then there is additional cost that needs to be covered for. But then this amount should not become an undue inducement that they are participating only for the sake of money. If you are paying, for example, a large amount of money, which happens in cases of clinical trials, the pharmaceutical companies often pay large amounts of money, which become an inducement to participation. So it has to be a right kind of balance where you don't want to give them less, you don't want to give them more, and that is why the role of ethics committee comes here. Then about privacy confidentiality, I think you all understand it very well, that privacy is the right to control what information can be collected from an individual. So we have a habit when we make a questionnaire, for example, we will write name, sex, date of birth, father's name, address, email ID. So you must really now see that what kind of information is needed to be collected for your study, what is required. Is there a follow-up action that you need to plan? Then you need all that information. Or who will have access to that information? How can you control that this information can be protected from unauthorized access? Because this is, it could have other problems. I mean, if it goes into wrong hands. So that limit has to be seen. And also because right at the time when you're doing research, you should plan that, you know, let's say you have to publish the research, then whether you would need to take, you're taking pictures, or you have you built it into your consent that information, identifying information about that individual can be published because you may be taking pictures. So those type of things should also be seen. Now, compensation, payment of compensation for injury that is related to participation for research is an ethical responsibility. But then this issue is really highly debated. People say, this is a student research, this is an investigator initiated research, we are an academic institution. From where will we get the money to pay any financial compensation? Now, what ICMR guidelines have said that when you prepare a research proposal, whether it's a grant scheme or a ad hoc project or a task force study, in your budget, when you ask a granting agency for a fund, you built in certain amount of small money for payments in case it is needed. First of all, it's more a hype payment of compensation, and it's not in reality so much, but it's a scare. And that's why a lot of people have stopped doing certain kind of intervention studies, because they say, oh, if there is a problem of compensation, we can't pay. And so one is that you built into your grants. The second is that institutions who are involved actively in research should try to build in a corpus fund. ICMR and other research agencies pay a certain, overhead charges. So these overhead charges can help to build the corpus money for such payments in case any medical management is required or any unforeseen events are there. The third is that institutions, many of them have sought an insurance mechanism through which they have built this into. So it's time that we all start thinking on this. Now, conflict of interest is another issue that is very tricky, because conflict of interest are these conditions where the professional judgments may be affected because of primary interest. Because, for example, your primary interest is to complete your thesis very quickly so that you can publish and you can get your PhD. Now, in the process, you may sideline certain procedures because of certain interests, because you want to get an award, or some personal or financial benefits, because the sponsor has said, if you finish this study in 2 months, this much amount of incentive will be paid. So there are various kind of things which are going on, and these are at the level of institutions, as the level of researchers, and also at the level of ethics committees, where the ethics committee members, the students' projects is being reviewed, and he or she is a member of the ethics committee, and they unduly influence to approve the study. Or a colleague who is, not a friendly relation, then you would try to reject a study. So these kind of influences happen, and therefore it's very difficult to handle conflicts of interest issues, which could be both financial as well as personal. But then it's important to declare these and to not be part of the decision-making process wherever possible. Then there is this thing about distributive justice, where individuals or communities where you are planning to do research should be selected in a way that they are the ones who are getting the burdens should also get the benefits. It should not be that they are being just exploited or samples are being collected and finally the results, the benefit sharing does not go back to this community. So it's very important principle that these communities also get the benefit of whatever comes out of it. And this plan should be right at the time when research is being planned. And people who are economically or socially disadvantaged or, should not be taken, because they are easy targets or, easy for your research. So they should not be used for benefit of others. Communities need to be engaged meaningfully. It's very easy to say we will engage with the community, but it has to be communication, good communication before planning the research, during the research conduct, and after the research is over, so that culturally sensitive issues are taken care of and the research is more meaningful. There are various mechanisms for the same. There are people who have formed community advisory boards or involved a member of the community as part of the research team, or have them attend ethics committee meetings so that they can guide and they can tell the problems that they're facing, and also to design the research that is answering their needs. We should know what is the need of this. It is the research topics are generally decided by us as researchers. We want to know what we want to study, but we don't consult what is the need of the community, whether the community actually needs that research or some other topic is more relevant to them. So it is very important to meaningfully engage with them. And the section on, that was general ethical issues. And then the third section is on responsible conduct of research, which I mentioned that it tells about how you could be a responsible member of the society as a good researcher. There should be institutional policies, standard operating procedures, conflict of interest declarations, monitoring, while data is collected, managed, shared, ownership in reviewing, reporting results, authorship issues, publication policies, collaborative research, how to talk about MOUs, memorandum of understandings, material transfer agreements, joint policies. All these issues have been discussed in this section. Then the whole section on ethics committees, I believe some of you are members of the ethics committees. And so the first and foremost thing is that ethics committees have to function independently. They have to be competent. And they have the responsibility of safeguarding the rights, welfare, safety of participants. And every type of biomedical and health research, if it involves a human being, should be reviewed before it is initiated. A lot of students come up or people come up for post facto approval of ethics by ethics committee for the research which is already conducted. And that is not acceptable. You have to take a prior approval before any research is to be conducted. And ethics committees have to be supported by the institutions who should give a budget, infrastructure, staff. Often ethics committees are working just like honorary committees and they have no money, no staff, no space. And for them to function properly, all this is needed. And members have to have qualifications and assigned role, and it's a multidisciplinary committee, so they have to have a defined role. A clinician role, or a social scientist has a different role. A lawyer has a role, a layperson, a representative of the public has a role, and therefore the members of the ethics committee also need training. And this is just a glimpse of what kind of trainings have to go into that. I'm not going into the detail of that. So, for example, I've just tried to show that, science and ethics aspects will be mainly looked at by clinicians or basic scientists. Legal experts may look at insurance policies, clinical trial or research agreements, institutional policies, and other such agreements. The social scientist or ethicists could look at socio-cultural, religious aspects. Then there could be subject experts who could be invited for their comments on specific science of it, and informed consent represent the laypersons represent the community, so they could review the informed consent process. So the guidelines have given in detail what is the role of each member, what is the qualification of each member, whether it is a chairperson, a member secretary, and then basic scientists, legal. All this has been explained in detail. So if you would like, you could have a look at that. Social scientists, layperson, their affiliation, qualifications, experience has been discussed, and also their actual role in the ethics committee. Now, what does ethics committee review? Often we have seen, because I have, as a surveyor of ethics committee, have seen that a lot of time ethics committees, because mainly it is made of scientists. So they will discuss science, a lot of science, but they will leave the ethics behind, or it will be a sketchy discussion on ethics. So other than, of course, science is very important. Unless there is good science, there won't be good ethics. So science is to be reviewed, but then you also need to look at ethics, which is what is the social value of research? What is the design conduct? Is it ethically viable? How the patients or participants will be selected? Is the benefit risk ratio appropriate? What payments are involved? Privacy, confidentiality, community considerations, qualifications, site-specific, medical management, compensation, informed consent issues, etc. Now, also there is a suggestion in the guideline that for multi-center research, for example, same protocol is being tested at many sites. There, one ethics committee could take the leading role of a designated ethics committee and take a decision, and rest of the sites can take, accept that decision of the main designated ethics committee. So that has also been given, and that will help to facilitate research. Then informed consent is an extremely important process, because here the role of the researcher becomes very important, because here is when you meet the participants. So it is, we don't call them subjects anymore. We don't say we call them participants, because we believe that they have to be part of your research. And that is why it is an informed consent process. So it's not a one-time event, because generally you say, oh, this is a sheet of paper, please sign it and give it back to me. Now that's not informed consent process. The process is a process which has to continue. It begins with a lot of discussion. It goes on through the time where the research is going on. All the concerns are discussed, question and answers happen before the signatures are happen. Adequate time is to be given for the person to think. You cannot put pressure. Like you can do, if you say like this, that, you have to sign now, otherwise you cannot participate. So if you sort of influence a participant, then he or she will not be able to voluntarily agree to participate. Now, what are the components of informed consent form? I have seen a lot of forms at ICMI, and a lot of people are developing generic forms. You can give that form because it will have a statement, all this, and without giving the real details. Now, it has to be, first of all, written in a language which is understandable to the participant, in very simplified manner, in simple, short sentences describing purpose and methods. Now, purpose and methods, for example, doesn't mean that you're doing a genetic association study, or you are doing a biochemical analysis. You explain all the biochemical steps of your procedure, or PCR, you start explaining. No, that's not it. The purpose and methods relate to the participation of that individual in a very simplified manner. The duration of participation, what are the benefits to that person? If there are no benefits, you can say very clearly, there are no direct benefits to you. It is for science. It will help to develop new tools. Later, it will be useful to the population. And then what kind of risks and discomforts are there? How you're going to protect the identity? How reimbursements will happen or give the freedom to participate. So all these are elements of basic. So on the left-hand side, what you see should be part of every consent form, but there are additional elements like alternatives, stigmatization, insurance, all this, which can be also added depending on the type of research that you're doing. So it's the responsibility of researcher. They have to translate. Now, I actually come from a Hindi speaking belt, and I have seen forms in Hindi, which I don't understand. Now, why? Because you get them translated through an official translator. You just, either you go to Google and do a Google Translate, which totally distorts the meaning oftentimes, or the official translators will put it in a language which is not understandable. The purpose of translation is to make it in a simple, रोजमर्रा की बातचीत की भाषा जो दूसरे लोग समझ सकें. So that kind of a simple language is the one. So the researcher is the best person to do these translations rather than official translations, and try for certain kind of research where there is a higher risk. Test of understanding is also done, where you would like to ask, okay, I have explained everything, now you answer this question. So that will help you understand whether that person is just saying, if you ask him, have you understood? You'll say, yes, I have understood. But if you ask him an open-ended question that, okay, tell me how many times you have to come, or when will be your follow-up, then you will know actually that whether the person has actually understood. Then dealing with people who are differently able, you have to have sensitivity to that, and to design tools for that. Good time for discussion, decision-making, no intimidation. Have impartial witnesses or legally authorized or legally acceptable representatives in place. For example, where people are not able to consent because of their disease or condition, or they have some challenge because of that. So you will need a representative. And how you document it could be in paper, or you do audiovisual, or any kind of electronic waiver. So all these things are also discussed. Now, people who are vulnerable, people who need adequately more protection than others because they are not able to protect their own rights, and there is a probability of harm. So it is a responsibility of the researcher to protect and to answer their health needs. So these are the people we must have some safeguards if we involve research involving them. And I believe a lot of research in the area of anthropology would involve a number of these. So you need to make sure that these people, their rights are well protected when research is planned. Now, a section on clinical trial, I'll not go into the details because not many of you may be involved in this, but there is a whole section in guideline on clinical trials. So if you do clinical trials, this section is important, and it says that there is Drugs and Cosmetics Act and rules which have to be followed if clinical trials are conducted. The section on public health research may be of use. We have talked about various kind of study designs, demographic surveys, implementation research, program evaluation, surveillance, screening programs, surveys. All of these have been discussed where or qualitative research designs are used, and how community consents can be taken, how, but still individual consent is important. So these kind of issues are discussed in this. And the section on genetics talks about new technologies. We just had a question on gene editing. The gene editing has also been described in this section. If you go to ICMR guideline, there is a brief one page on what are the ethical safeguards that you need to carry if you're planning gene editing or CRISPR or any such new technologies are there, and you need to take care of the ethical, legal, social issues that are involved. Now, biobanking is an important area because as was being discussed in the last lecture also, a lot of samples you will have to deal with, a lot of human material. So how do you make sure that these samples can be rightfully used? Now, the ancient material, it's a different thing. But if you're talking, prospective study, then you have to make sure whether it is anonymous sample or anonymous data, or whether it is anonymized or coded data, or it is identified data, and accordingly consent has to be taken. But for other material for which you don't know whom this belongs to, there the institutional becomes the custodian of this information, and appropriate approvals have to be taken to with whom you could share. So you cannot freely share unless there are appropriate agreements, and so for what purpose will it be used, and what will be the ownership, and all these issues have been discussed in this section. Then the last section is on humanitarian emergencies and disaster, which is going on now, which talks about how research should be done. But then when we had this COVID pandemic, we realized that we needed to have a more detailed guidelines, and therefore this new guideline document was prepared by ICMR and released in May actually. And this is specifically when research is being done during the COVID-19 pandemic. There are certain suggestions that have been made, because now ethics committees meetings are video meetings, and they are not actual face-to-face meetings. So some suggestions are there how to facilitate, and also preventing the stigma or privacy. Now, the conflict between, on one hand, you want to protect privacy and confidentiality of an individual, but on the other hand, you have mandatory disclosure because it's a public health emergency. You have to declare to public health authorities, and weigh how oral or electronic methods of consenting can be used, which have been discussed. So you could use technology, which is text, graphs, videos, etc., in order to take care of to consenting with these individuals, how digital signatures could be used. And now it's very practically challenging. A lot of people have written to us, people who are in isolation, quarantine, or they are in COVID ward where you cannot go. How do you take actually informed consent from these people? So now it is time that we have to move on to electronic methods of consenting, whether it is audio or video or through an app. So it's time to develop technology, or to look at people where you are having people who have decisional capacities low because of the disease that they are suffering, because of their critical illness or moderate illness, or even their mental, social, this whole thing about this is so, scary for a lot of people. So in such kind of, when you involve participants of that kind, you have to be very extra careful because of their mental and social status. And they are often in the condition where they're not able to differentiate between what is a relief measure, or what is a clinical care that has been provided, and what is a research. Because we have different requirements when you're taking a care versus different requirements when you are doing clinical practice, or something which is for their care and relief versus research. Now, a lot of people also ask, can I get waiver of consent? Now, waiver of consent is that you first of all, as a researcher, I cannot decide whether a waiver can be given. It can be requested, and the ethics committee is the right body to grant a waiver of consent. And so as a researcher, you have to justify that, because of such and such reasons, my study involves, does not involve interaction with participants directly, or I'm not collecting identifiable information, or I'm working on retrospective samples or data. So because of which waiver can be justified, and then you can request the ethics committee for a waiver and carry out. And this may be true for many public health programs, surveillance programs, program evaluations, or for data that is available in public domain, or emergency situations where the person cannot give you a written consent. So in this case, with an ethics committee approval, the waiver can be taken. And right now, you know, because of the pandemic, we have seen from various institutions, ethics committees meetings have actually improved because they're able to meet very fast, you know, quickly in a short span. In fact, even we in ICMR, we've had a turnaround time of reviewing and approving a proposal or disapproving whatever in 72 hours. So things have been moving very fast. So because of the online, you don't have to see availability, and most of the people would be available, and it's easy to do the meeting. So ethics committees have become very time bound and very efficient actually. Now also in this pandemic, it's important to understand new vulnerabilities that have been added. You know, people, even healthcare workers are vulnerable because they are exposed to this infection. They are working in a very tight scenarios, wearing PPEs, and have a lot of psychological stress. There are people, we have heard a lot about how migrant workers had difficulty. So we have these issues. And then elderly are extremely vulnerable, more vulnerable to, you know, because of their age and their, you know, susceptibility to the infection, and with more adverse outcomes. So we have to be very careful when research is being planned for them. Now, I would also like to just inform you that to clarify a bit about research, because I thought this is very important and there is some confusion that is there in people generally. So basically, you see, there are, I've tried to describe the types of research that is there. So one is, we have been, whatever I've been talking so far was biomedical and health research. And that is under the Department of Health Research Ministry of this, and also DBT and other agencies, CSIR would be engaged in a lot of biomedical health research. And also there's another type of research which would be clinical trials. Now these are regulated. These are tightly regulated by the Central Drug Standards and Control Organization, also called as the Drugs Controller General of India under the Drugs and Cosmetics Act. So depending on the type of research, there is a regulatory framework that has been set up in the country. So whether it is basic science research or clinical research, population-based research, translational research, it will all come under the Department of Health Research, and any ethics committee that is involved in reviewing this kind of research has to be registered now with the Department of Health Research. However, if somebody is engaging in clinical trials, which is under Drugs and Cosmetics Act, there the ethics committee needs to register with CDSCO. So this is one clarity I wanted to bring. So the CDSCO is the National Regulatory Authority. And again, it is also working towards protection of safety, rights, well-being. So there are a set of rules that have been prepared by CDSCO for clinical trials. They're trying to bring transparency, accountability, and we have tried to harmonize between the ethical requirement for all kinds of research in India. Of course, there are more specific requirements for clinical trials because it is intervention studies. And then this is about the national registry that has been recently set up in the Department of Health Research. Now, every ethics committee in the country is required to register with this NECRDHR, you know, the National Ethics Committee Registry for Biomedical and Health Research. So including one at TU or other universities is now required. And this is now a regulatory requirement. Of course, it is under the new drugs clinical trial rules where DHR has been designated as the authority for registration, but this covers all kinds of biomedical and health research that happens in the country. Now, ICMR had given out a press release last year on this, that following ICMR ethical guidelines is now mandated. It's mandated by law to be adhered to for all biomedical health research in the country, and registration with DHR is also mandated. So this was a press release that was given out. And in the end, I would also like to point out that ICMR guidelines have an international standing, and this is the only guideline. This is just a screenshot from the US website of OHRP, where, for example, for federal-wide assurance, that is an ethics committee registration process there. The only guidelines, if you see, other than the US rules, you know, the common rule, and this is all US rules, the other documents that are accepted by them are the GCP guidelines, the CIOMS guideline, the Canadian guideline, and Indian guidelines. So Indian guidelines are the only guidelines from any of the any part of the globe that are also considered as equivalent protection to the OHRP requirements. So I urge you all that, you know, this is a copy of the guideline, which you could, you know, just download from the website, or it is available at a small cost of 500 rupees, or otherwise freely you can download it. And also this, this is my last slide, and just to thank you all, you could download copies, and if you, most of the other guidelines are complimentary, and you could just write us and we can share with you. And as I mentioned earlier, that the handbook of ethical guidelines is an important, you know, guideline which could be, you know, used by the researchers and students. It will be very useful for students. It's just a summary and abstract of it. So with that, I'd like to end my presentation, and thank you all for patiently hearing, and I'll be happy to answer your questions.